Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another Sunday read along. Last year, or rather every year, I read Homer's Iliad in June. And there was a year, I mentioned that on this channel a few times, and then there was a year where I just decided to bring you along for my read along of the Iliad in June. And this year, when faced, we're doing read alongs on Sunday now on this channel forever. And this year, when I was faced with another read along, I thought, oh, well, we can either do some other book, or you can do what I do and reread the Iliad. And the votes, not that this isn't a vicious autocracy, but the votes were overwhelming to do both. So we are doing the Iliad. We're doing Anthony Trollope's The Prime Minister, but we're also rereading the Iliad. So we're doing the first 6 books of Homer's Iliad today. And those first 6 books start with the famous quarrel. Uh, the Greeks have been besieging the city of Troy for years now. When the book starts famously in medias res. So the story is ongoing, and we don't get any foregrounding. A good introduction will give you what you need to know to jump right in, or the Wikipedia entry. But the poem starts off with the war in full swing. The Greek forces, led by High King Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus, have laid siege to the city of Troy because a prince of Troy, Paris, abducted Menelaus' wife Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, and brought her back to Troy. Menelaus is Agamemnon's brother. He agitates with his brother to go to war. There will, of course, it's not just wounded armor props, it's also there'll be an enormous amount of booty if you conquer Troy. It's not a small thing. It's something Agamemnon might have considered on his own. In fact, there might be a bit of window dressing. But one way or another, the famous 1,000 ships are assembled, all the great captains of Greece, Odysseus and Achilles and the shorter Ajax and the taller Ajax and Idomeneus and a whole bunch of others. They sail for Troy and lay siege to the city. And in order to provision themselves, they are constantly doing raiding up and down the coast. And during one of those raids, they capture the daughter of a priest of Apollo. And the priest of Apollo is naturally aggrieved at this. And he prays to Apollo to smite the Danaans for my tears, to punish the Greeks for stealing my daughter, the daughter of your faithful priest. And Apollo hears his prayer and strides down from Mount Olympus, sits himself across from the Greek encampment, and begins to shoot arrows of plague at them. We're told in what I'm sure is an etiological detail. I'm sure that it's based on someone somewhere along the way in the composition of this epic poem, seeing the way some plagues behave in real life. We're told that it started with the pigs and the horses, and then moved its way up to the men. But by the time it gets going, the funeral pyres are roaring night and day for the dead in the Greek camp, and something needs to be done. And when that something turns out to be, we need to send the girl back to her father. A seer for the Greek army says, well, I will read the signs for you. I will tell you what's going on here, but you're not going to like it. And I would like some protection. If, for instance, I say something that's going to offend someone very powerful here in this gathering of the leaders of the army. And Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, and a legendary figure in his own right, tells the priest, you need not worry. Anything you say, I protect you. And the story is laid out. We need to send the girl back. Now, the girl is the property of Agamemnon himself. And he doesn't come off well in this first book. He comes across as a starting egomaniac with a persecution complex. Not entirely inaccurate. And he has no love for Achilles, and Achilles has no love for him. And Agamemnon mentions, well, if you're going to take this girl from me, I want recompense. And Achilles somewhat sourly says to him, well, do you notice a great store of extra treasure and slaves that we have here? The next time we go on a raid, the pick of it will be for you, and that's not good enough for Agamemnon. He says, no, if you're going to take my woman, my concubine, my war prize, then I demand yours. And it's a tense moment. Achilles is actually tempted to kill his high king, right there in front of all the others. Athena, the goddess Athena, comes down from Olympus and invisibly stops him from doing that. But even though she saves Agamemnon's life and temporarily forestalls the quarrel, Achilles decides to withdraw himself and his men, also the greatest fighters, from the battle, from the war. They will not sail home, but they will not leave their encampment on the shore. Well, that's a major thing. That's a major thing. We can sense right away, without the interference of the gods from Olympus, we can sense right away that that withdrawal might have a large part to do with the sudden seesawing of victory back and forth between the two forces. We get the feeling that maybe things had been going fairly well for the Greeks. It had been sort of a grinding stalemate a little bit in their favor. But if such a powerful contingent leaves the field of battle, it's no wonder, regardless of gods, it's no wonder that things would start to pitch back and forth. That's the opening of the Iliad, is that quarrel. And then Homer, whoever Homer was, or whoever, whatever format, I myself think I know how we got this book. This is part of a much larger oral tradition with many stories and a great deal of emphasis. There was an epic about the sailing to Troy and the adventures along the way. There was an epic about the first year of the battle and the introduction of all these characters to all of their Trojan counterparts. There was a story about the summoning of the army and all of the Greek kings who did not want to go to war. There were epics about all of those things, just in the repertoire of these bards who went from hall to hall, from kingdom to kingdom. And I think this is just the one we got written down. There's strong evidence that there were plenty of others, and there are fragments of others being written down. I always like to think what it would be like if we had that whole corpus of epic tapestry. But this is the one that we got, and it assumes that we already know the story, and that we already know the characters, and that we already know the literary and historical antecedents to all of them. It assumes we know all of that, and we don't. So this can be a bit intimidating. And in addition to that intimidation, right at the beginning, we get an even worse thing, which is that in the second book of the Iliad, Homer decides to tell us who's who, to give us a rundown of the warriors on the Greek side. He has old King Priam of Troy call Helen of Troy over to him and say, tell me who these people are that I'm looking at. Now that in itself is unrealistic, because he's been looking at these people for years. He knows who they are. But it's a device, it's a narrative device on the part of Homer to introduce characters to us, which would be fine in very limited amount, but it doesn't happen in limited amount. Instead, the second book of the Iliad includes one of the biggest obstacles to reading the Iliad, in my opinion. A lot of people who read this book are intimidated because they're dropped off right in the middle of it with a cast of thousands, and they don't know what's going on. But even if they get a grappling hold by their fingernails on that original plot, they're still hit right in the face in book 2 with an inventory of people and ships from all the different kingdoms. And it goes on and on and on. I have had many students who simply failed. That the inventory of the army simply beat them. They couldn't go on. No matter how much I told them, there's a lot more coming. There's a lot more of interest coming. No matter how much I told them that, they simply failed when they got to the inventory of ships. And I'm hoping that didn't happen to you, because there is a lot more, there is a lot more coming. That inventory of ships had some very practical reasons behind it. If you were a bard and you were going to, a kingdom in the Peloponnese, and you knew that your host had a family tradition that an ancestor of his took part in the siege of Troy, then you're going to want that ancestor to be part of that roster of ship captains. You're going to want that distant relative to be named in that roster of names. And it never, even the people who originally designed this poem and were originally reciting it never dreamed that that people would still be talking about it 2,000 years later. So I'm hoping, if this is your first time in the Iliad, I'm hoping that you got past the roster of the ships, because things start to happen right away anyway. Even in the midst of that chapter, things start to happen right away. There's actually a lot that happens in these first 6 books. The major things and minor things, like, for instance, the armies decide, they arrange a duel, an individual duel between Paris and Menelaus. And they say, both Priam and Agamemnon say, all right, well, the war will depend on the outcome of this duel. We will have, this is the man who was offended, and this is the man who offended him. So we will have them meet in individual combat. And the The war will be decided on the outcome. We will abide by the result of this individual war. Menelaus is a very powerful fighter, and Paris is not. And their duel, when it happens, is a disaster. It's a disaster of a mismatch. Paris never really has much of a chance, and ends up, in very quick order, being humiliatingly dragged by his helmet. Menelaus, his weapons have shattered, but Menelaus is still infinitely stronger than Paris, and at one point just grabs him by the horsehair helmet on his head, and the chin strap underneath the helmet is holding it on Paris's head, and just drags him by his head back to the encampment, supposedly to slaughter him like a pig. It's incredibly humiliating, and Paris is saved by the gods. One of the things that those of you who are new to this poem, who are coming to it for the first time, are going to see is that it's not much different from reading epic fantasy. The gods on Mount Olympus are not figures of imagination, and they aren't allegories. They're superpowered beings. They aren't human, but they take a very great interest in human activities, and they very much are involved in the war on one side or another. And they're physical beings. They just because Minerva is invisible in the first book of the Iliad doesn't mean that that's going to stay true. It doesn't. The gods are physical beings, incredibly powerful physical beings who get involved and have passions of their own. And the gods try to save Paris. In fact, they do save him. They break the chin strap so that he is free and can be whispered away from the battle. And that immediately makes the Greeks call foul. And warfare erupts again. And we get a lot of that warfare. We get very graphic details. It gets worse as the poem goes on, more graphic. But it's pretty graphic now, even in these first 6 books. And another thing that happens early on in this book is that Agamemnon is visited with a dream. A dream comes to him. In the world of the Iliad, dreams are physical things. They're messages that come to you. They're not Freudian. Thank God. This whole book exists in a pre-Freudian world where it was not touched by any nonsense like that. So a dream comes to Agamemnon, and he is told the strife between the gods over who will win and who will lose here is over. The war is yours to win. Troy is yours. Go forth, inflame your men with enthusiasm, arm your men, and take the city. And Agamemnon, he wakes up and he remembers that dream, and he calls his captains together and says, I've just had a dream in which victory was promised to me by the gods. And then, because he's Agamemnon, he decides that's not good enough. I've had a dream from the gods. They have vouchsafed it to me as the consecrated high king of Greece. They say we're going to win and that victory is assured. Troy is ours. But I'm thinking I'm going to play a mind game on the troops. I'm going to tell them that my dream actually said we're going to lose. You should make for home. You should run for your ships. There's no way we're going to take Troy. We're all doomed. His captains seem less than enthusiastic, but he does it. He calls his men together and says, we're all doomed. I had a dream from the gods. We cannot possibly win. Run for your ships. Now, his twisted idea is that if he does that, he will test the loyalty of the men. That they will, for once in their lives, say that divine omens need to be defied instead of obeyed. It's ridiculous. It's meant, I think, to show us what Agamemnon is like as a person. And it's not a very good picture at all. And predictably, these men who've had nothing but deprivation and hardship and war for years bolt for their ships. When they're told by their high king that he's received a vision from heaven that tells him, bolt for your ships, they bolt for their ships. And the captains have to rush out to stop them and turn them around and bring them back. And one of the complainers is a Greek soldier named Thersites. He's memorable. People have written a lot about him. There have been novels and plays and operas about him. He vocally and somewhat sourly complains about their lot as Greek soldiers until Ulysses beats him with his staff of office. He doesn't just verbally browbeat him. He beats him physically back into line so that he's crying because he's hurt so bad. And people have always seized on that little moment, on Thersites' little moment. But there are much bigger moments to come in these 6 books, because once warfare starts again, the queen of the gods, Juno and Minerva, go to Jupiter and ask him, well, Mars is running rampant on the field. He's not just inspiring soldiers to do their best, he's also killing Greeks on his own. As a god among men, as a god rampaging on the field, he's killing people. Can't we go and stop him? And Jupiter says, absolutely, go and stop him. And So they do. They rush down to the battlefield where the Greek soldier Diomedes has been fighting like crazy. He's been killing people left and right. And he actually assaulted Mars and was rebuffed. And previously, the goddess Minerva had told Athena had told him, "There's only one god you can really attack. If you see Athena or Aphrodite, if you see Venus on the field, you can attack her because she's the weakest of us and she's not made for war. And if you wound her, she won't kill you or do anything like that. She'll just run." And Diomedes does see her, and he does wound her, and she flees back to Olympus and into her mother's arms, and her mother heals her. And her mother also, while she's healing her, tells her a long list of times when the immortal gods of Olympus have been wounded by mortals. It isn't just, this is not the first time. Her mother says every time, basically every time, we contend with these creatures of flesh and blood, they draw blood. Some of them manage to hurt us in some way or other. There's a fascinating detail. I'm not sure what the motherly rationale is for giving your daughter that story when she's bleeding ichor all over you. But one way or another, Diomedes is emboldened by his success and actually assaults Apollo, who has entered the field. He's on the battlefield. Apollo brushes him aside like a fly and says, "Enough is enough. Stop attacking gods. It's not your place to attack gods." And that kind of high-pitched, high-fantasy drama, I'm asking, especially those of you who are coming to the Iliad new, did that surprise you? That happens? And did it entertain you? I myself think it's fantastic. I've read it, and I don't know how many times, and I love reading it. I love reading Homer's mixture of supernatural creatures and human flesh and blood creatures is so great. It's so entertaining to read. And the battle flashes back and forth. That's always a standby. And at one point, at the end of the books that we're reading today, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, Prince Hector. It's an incredibly touching moment. The moment with Thersites is always remembered. People always remember that from the Iliad. But the moment that I'm talking about with Hector is even more remembered. He goes, during a respite from battle, he goes into the city and meets with his wife, who is carrying his baby child. And the baby is frightened by Hector's enormous helmet. Hector has to take his helmet off to stop the baby from being afraid. And in his head, Hector is thinking, well, I know what I want from you, baby boy. I want you to be an even greater prince than me. I want people in Troy to say, well, his father was great, but he's even greater. That's what I want from you. But both Hector and his wife seem to know that's not what's going to happen. It's a very somber moment. And it would be somber enough if it were just Hector talking with his wife, but the baby, we know there isn't going to be any safe exit for babies from a conquered city. There is no fate awaiting that baby that is not horrifying. It's an extremely touching moment. It has nothing to do with battle. The Iliad is often viewed as this battle poem, and it is. But a lot of the great moments in it have nothing to do with battle, and that's one of them. And that ends the 6 books that we're reading today. So I want to wrap that up for here. We'll talk about the next 6 books next Sunday, but I want to know what you thought about these first 6 books. I want to know what you thought if you're doing a read-along as a reread, if you read this with me last year, or if you've read the Iliad before. But I confess, I especially want to know what you thought if that's not true. I especially want to know what you thought if you're coming to this for the first time. What did you make of all of this? I'm really hoping that you got past the inventory of the ships. I should have warned you about that, but I didn't. That's my mistake. I should have. When I've taught this book, I've always warned students, you're going to get to what looks like an interminable New York phone book of names and country addresses. Just power on through it, or if you want, skip it. Because all of those characters, all the important characters in that roster of ships, are reintroduced when they have their moments in the sun. So you don't actually need it. It was a placeholding thing. Believe it or not, you look at that blizzard of names and places, you think, I couldn't memorize this if my life depended on it. But actually, it's easier to memorize than what comes next in the action. It's a solid, unmoving set piece. And oftentimes, bards loved those set pieces, absolutely loved them, because it gives you a mental moment to stop and refresh before you have to move on. So I'm hoping that all of you got past it, but especially you first-timers, I would love to know what you made of these first 6 books, because it had to surprise you, right? This is not Greeks versus the Trojans. This is Greeks versus the Trojans and everybody versus the gods, who are right there on the battlefield, fighting with weapons and getting wounded. and wounding other people. So I'll wrap this up for now so I don't go on forever. But let me know what you thought of these 6 books, and we'll move on. Next Sunday we'll do the next 6 books. I'll see you then. Thank you, Book 2.